Good morning, crime community. I'm going to continue reading out Poisoner in Chief. Hopefully, this is the last part of the chapter, The Secret That Was Going to Unlock the Universe. As Gottlieb's far-flung research project was searching new extremes, politics intervened to guarantee its future. On November 4th, 1942, America elected Dwight Eisenhower to the presidency. His victory ensured that Gottlieb would be free to do whatever he wished or could imagine. One of the few senior officials in Washington with whom Eisenhower had worked closely was the Director of Central Intelligence, General Walter Bedell Smith, who had been his chief of staff during World War II. After taking office, he made Smith Undersecretary of State. This left the top CIA job open. Eisenhower considered several candidates and finally chose the one who wanted the job most fervently, Allen Dulles. And another project might have done with Gottlieb's mind control project. Whether he might have sought to curtail it or end it cannot be known. With Dulles secure in power, though, Gottlieb had free reign, and if this were not good enough news, Eisenhower selected Dulles' older brother, John Foster Dulles, as Secretary of State. This meant that State Department could be relied upon to support whatever Gottlieb did abroad, including giving black sites all the diplomatic cover they needed. Newly engaged Gottlieb pressed ahead with the task he had been given, pursue mind control research as far as he could go. He had already brought several doctors into his orbit and was publishing them to carry out tests on psychoactive drugs. One of them, Paul Hoch of New York Psychiatric Institute, agreed to inject mescaline into one of his patients to its effect could be observed. He chose a 42-year-old professional tennis player named Harold Maurer, who had come to him seeking treatment for depression following a divorce. Beginning on December 5th, 52, one of Hoch's assistants injected Maurer with a concentrated mescaline derivative without explanation or warning. The next month, he was injected 5 more times. He complained that the treatment was giving him hallucinations and asked that it be ended, but Hoch insisted that he proceed. On January 8th, 53, Blau was given a dose 14 times greater than the previous ones. The protocol noted that he protested when he was injected at 9:53 a.m., and 6 minutes later he was flailing wildly. At 10:01, his body stiffened. He was pronounced dead at 12:15. We didn't know if it was dog piss or what we were giving him, one of the medical assistants later claimed. Gottlieb's first 18 months of experiments brought him so close to understanding how hallucinogenic drugs could be used to control minds. On the contrary, they forced him to confront frustrating realities. These drugs were no true serum. The visions they produced often ordered interrogations rather than helping them, nor were they effective amnesiacs. Subjects often realized they had been drugged and remembered and experienced afterward. It seemed that another class of drugs could be added to barbiturates, sedatives, cannabis extracts, cocaine, and heroin, on the list of those that cannot be reliably used to make people talk. This left Gottlieb to choose between two conclusions. Either there is no such thing as a mind control drug, or there is indeed such a thing, and it is waiting to be discovered. He had been hired to explore, not to give up. This was also his nature. Like his artichoke comrades, he believed he could find a way to control human minds. Before any of the others, he concluded that it lay within LSD. He recognized it as a highly complex substance, believed it might have decisive value in clandestine work, and was determined to study it further. Once Allen Dulles was installed as Director of Central Intelligence, Gottlieb's bureau ambition grew. He knew Dulles would support any project he proposed. What would it be? This is a period when Gottlieb was conducting his own self-experimentation with LSD, so his imagination was fertile. He reflected on the broadening ambition of CIA mind control projects. This is the moment he decided to broaden it further. Gottlieb received the idea of a new project that would sublime Artichoke and give him authority over all CIA research into mind control. With this mandate, he would test every imaginable drug and technique, plus some not even yet imagined. He would be free not only to experiment on expendables at secret prisons abroad, but also to feed LSD to writing and unwitting Americans. Witting and unwitting Americans. From there, we would go on to test, study, and investigate every substance or method that might be used as a tool to control minds. Any experiments and all would be considered under the umbrella of the single program that he would run. Richard Helms, the now chief of operations of the CIA's Directorate of Plans, shared Gottlieb's enthusiasm. Together, they composed a memorandum for Dulles describing what the program would aim to do. Gottlieb was about to launch the most systematic and widest-ranging mind control project ever undertaken by any government. At the same time, he was assuming his other important role, poisoner-in-chief. Together, it fit well. Gottlieb was the CIA's senior chemist. He had directed the application of unknowable quantities and varieties of drugs into living humans. As a result of those experiments, he knew as much as any American about the effects of toxins on the human body. If CIA officers or anyone else in the U.S. government needed poison, he was a logical person to produce it. On the evening of March 30th, 1953, Allen Dulles sat down for dinner at his Georgetown home with one of his senior officers, James Kronthal. The two men had been OSS comrades in Europe and remained close. On that night, Dulles had the most unpleasant news. He told Kronthal that the CIA officers, two of whom were eavesdropping at that moment, had discovered his awful secret. He was a pedophile who had been compromised on film and blackmailed into working as a double agent, first for the Nazis and then as the Soviets. Dulles spoke sadly about the ways personnel compulsion can destroy careers. Two men parted around midnight. Security officers accompanied Kronthal home. Later in the morning, he was found dead in his second floor bedroom. The CIA security director, Colonel Sheffield Edwards, wrote in his report that the empty vial had been found by the body and was presumed that he had taken poison. Years later, one of the era CIA security officers, Robert Crowley, related to Aleister Crowley. Robert Crowley was involved in the murder of the assassination of the president. He gave up all the information, so he was trying to do the right thing, and at the end, he was known as the Crow. Robert Crowley, look him up. Surmised what had happened, and he who had made the poison. Allen probably had a special potion prepared, for he gave to Kronthal, Crowley said. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and the medical people produced all kinds of poisons that a normal post-mortem could not detect. What that dramatic episode was unfolding, Helms and Gottlieb were working on their memorandum proposing that the CIA launch a newly broadened mind control project. Helms sent it to Dulles on April 3rd, just 4 days after Dulles hosted Kronthal's farewell dinner. The redacted version of his memo had been declassified. If it, Helms reported that an extremely sensitive research project had been actively underway since the middle of 1952 and had gathered considerable momentum in the last few months. He recommends that this project be expanded to include experiments of such an ultra-sensitive nature that they cannot and should not be handled by means of contracts which would associate the CIA or the government with the work in question. These experiments lie entirely within two self-defined fields of endeavor. A, to develop a capability to the covert use of biological and chemical materials. This included the production of various psychological conditions which could support present or future clandestine operations. Aside from the offensive potential and the development of the comprehensive capabilities of this field of covert chemical and biological warfare gives us a thorough knowledge of the enemy's theoretical potential. Excuse me. Thus enabling us to defend ourselves against a foe who might not be as restrained in the use of these techniques as we are. For example, we intend to investigate the development of a chemical material which causes a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state, and the special nature of which can be reasonably well predicted for each individual. This material could potentially aid in discrediting individuals, eliciting information, implanting suggestion, and other forms of mental control. B is redacted. On April 10, 1953, as Dulles was considering this proposal, He described it in a revealing speech to a group of his fellow Princeton University alumni gathered in Hot Springs, Virginia. He couched his revelations in an ingenious disguise, claiming to be speaking out about a Soviet project rather than an American one. No one in the room could have cracked the code that he was speaking. From the perspective of history, however, it is clear that his words applied precisely to the experiments that CIA officers and Camp Dietrich scientists were carrying out at that moment and were about to become even more intense. Dulles began his speech by asking whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become. He avoided mentioning the techniques his men were using, but did refer to endless interrogation by teams of brutal interrogators while the victims were being deprived of sleep. The goal of this and other forms of abuse, he said, was the perversion of the minds of selected individuals who are subjected to such treatment that they are deprived of the ability to state their own thoughts. Parrot-like, the individual so conditioned can repeat thoughts which have been implanted in their minds by suggestion from outside. In effect, the brain under these circumstances becomes a phonograph, playing a disc put on its spindle by an outside genius over which he has no control. Welcome to the CIA's comprehension of the vinyl community. We might call it its new form, brain warfare. The target is warfare. It is the minds of men on a collective and on an individual basis. The aim is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or a rational basis, but a response to impulses implanted from outside. The human mind is the most delicate of instruments. It is so finely adjusted, so susceptible to the impact of outside influences, that it is proving malleable in the hands of sinister men. The Soviets are now using brain perversion as one of their main weapons in prosecuting the Cold War. Some of these techniques are so subtle and so abhorrent to our way of life that we have recoiled from facing up to them. Dulles finished his speech with a plaintive lament. We in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare. He said, we have no human guinea pigs to try these extraordinary techniques. The opposite was true. Dulles was claiming high moral ground by saying that he, the CIA, and the government of the United States would never stoop to brutal experiments on unwilling human subjects. Through his Bluebird and Artichoke projects, however, he had been conducting such experiments for 2 years. Dulles never recoiled from his most extreme implications of brain warfare. The memo Helms had sent him proposed just the kind of no-holds-barred project he wanted to launch. It was a fashionable among the group to fancy that they were rather impersonal about dangers, risks, and human life. One of the early CIA men, Ray Klein, said years later, Helms would think it's sentimental and foolish to be against anything like this. Under Gottlieb's direction, with Dulles's encouragement and Helms's bureaucratic protection, Artichoke had become one of the most violently abusive projects ever sponsored by the agency of the United States government. This time had come. Dulles now agreed to intensify and systemize it. Gottlieb had proven himself. He was ready for a new responsibility, unique in American history. Only a handful of people know he was assuming it. On April 3, 1953, Dulles formally approved the research project Helms had proposed 10 days before, that made Gottlieb America's mind control czar. He set to work with 3 assets, a starting budget of $300,000, no subject to financial controls, permission to launch research and to conduct experiments at will, without the signing of the usual contracts or other written agreements, and a new cryptonym. Tradecraft dictates that cryptonyms should have no meaning, that if discovered, they provide no clue about the project they described. Nonetheless, Dulles could not resist giving this new project name that reflected that he called its ultra-sensitive material, or nature. Gottlieb's project would be called MK Ultra. That's the end of that chapter. The secret that was going to unlock the universe. The next chapter, chapter 5, is going to be called Abolishing Consciousness. which we will continue on another day. I hope you've learned something from that chapter. Like and subscribe and share. Have a good day.